Yes, please. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever, wherever you were. Thank you so much for attending today's lecture series on higher education, organization, and management, jointly organized by Peking University and the University of Tampere at Finland. So today we have a great honor to invite Professor Bjorn Stensaker to our discussion series. And he's going to give a presentation on investigating change and continuity in higher education, organizational identity as a concept for understanding university dynamics. He's a professor of higher education at the University of Oslo and the current Vice Rector for Education. He's also a research professor at the Nordic Institute of Studies in Innovation, Research, and Education in Oslo. His educational background is political science, and he received his PhD from University of Twente in the Netherlands on the study of organizational change process in Norwegian higher education. He has an interest in policy reform, governance, and organizational change in higher education in Scandinavia, Europe, and beyond. And he has published widely on these issues in a range of academic journals and international book series. So today we have the great honor to have him and share not only his years of research experiences, but also the current reflection on the policy reforms. Before we inviting him for the presentation, I want to announce our online lecture protocols. Please remember this lecture is being recorded, and parts of the lecture that were allowed to be shared by our speakers will be available on the website on the Sino-Finnish Education Research Center at the Tampere University. The presentation slides will also be available there. During the online lecture, please keep yourself muted unless you are asked to speak or ask a question at the Q&A part. You can keep your video on if you wish. We recommend using the speaker wheel that can be selected in the top right corner of your Zoom screen so that you could clearly see who is speaking. To ask a question, please use the chat function to indicate your question or comments. And then the facilitator will invite you to raise a question in the Q&A part, or will read it to the speakers. When you are invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, turn on your camera, state your name and which institutions you are from. All right, so the floor is yours. Please, Professor.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone in different time zones, Europe, China, and beyond. The topic for my presentation here today is, as Pooh said, investigating change and continuity in higher education. And while the focus will be on organizational identity, which is one of these analytical concepts that I have found to be very fruitful in my own research, my idea here today is that this is not just a lecture of the advantages of using organizational identity in future studies in the sector, but I will also try to advance an argument for why analytical concepts, organizational identity being one of them, could be a very interesting way also to develop higher education as a research field. Because I think those of us being present in this room, I think we all know that higher education studies is not a discipline. It is an empirical research area, and there is a lot of research investigating higher education that comes from a lot of different disciplinary and professional areas, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, educationalists, and so on. So this is a very multifaceted and multidisciplinary research area. And of course, it is very fruitful. I mean, higher education research is still a relatively young research field in the world, especially compared to some of the older fields like mathematics and what have you. So this fragmentation and this creativity that we see in higher education is, of course, it could be seen as a huge advantage. At the same time, it could also be seen as a problem, because how can we actually pull the research that we are doing together? How can we create accumulative knowledge in this field? So I hope that focusing on analytical concepts and the advantages of using analytical concepts more in our studies, that could actually hope to that could be a contribution that could also contribute to unite this very fragmented research area. There is also one more reason why I would like to talk about analytical concepts in higher education, and that goes back to the early days of higher education research, actually. I mean, if we go back 50 years when higher education research was still an infant, if we can use that kind of expression, there were some of those that were really the ancestors of higher education research, such as Burton Clark in the US. He started, and others as well, they coined some analytical concepts that not only described higher education, but also had a lot of influence on other fields like standard sociology, like standard organizational theory. Just to mention a few examples, when Burton Clark wrote his article about organizational sagas back in 1972, which he published in a generic organizational theory journal, that article had a huge influence on the development of organizational culture as a research field. Likewise, when Carl Weick came up with this concept of organized anarchies, which is one of those expressions that we often use to describe universities, that kind of concept has also inspired a lot of other organizational studies in other fields. If we, for example, go to Henry Mintzberg, that is one of those very influential organizational theorists located in Canada. I mean, his concept of how professional bureaucracies work is basically an extension of some of these ideas that Carl Weick used to work with in his article. Otherwise, in a similar way, Martin Olson's expressions of concept of garbage can as showing the randomness that is associated to decision making, because they studied decision making in a university setting, and they discovered that decision making in university setting is perhaps not as rational and is influenced by other things than rationality. It's about coincidence. It's about whether the time is right for a type of suggestion. So that kind of understanding of decision making also influenced a lot of leadership studies that came later. So this is one of the aims of the current lecture, to try to show that also there is a potential that we here in higher education not only use analytical concept, but perhaps we should also try to develop analytical concepts that others can benefit from. So the basic aim of the presentation here today is to it's to try to start to answer the question of how we can develop richer explanations and understandings of how the higher education sector is developing. And of course, the background of this is, what are the current research challenges in higher education? And of course, these can be different in different parts of the world. But I think there are some common denominators that we also can identify, regardless of whether we are located in China, in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere. I think what we have seen during the last decades in higher education is a tremendous expansion of higher education, mass higher education. So the higher education sector has been built out in so many different parts of the world. China is one example. And of course, building up a sector like higher education also means that more money is being spent on the sector. So from being a relatively minor sector, also of minor economic influence, we see that suddenly higher education, along with healthcare and similar sectors, it's becoming a very important sector, not least if we look at the resources that are being spent. And of course, the more resources that are being spent on a sector, the more interested is the public in finding out, okay, are the money spent in wise ways? Do higher education actually, are they accountable for the resources that we spend on the sector? So in that sense, you could also see that higher education, from being looked upon as perhaps being a very special sector in society, we have become more normal, especially regarding state steering, because we are being exposed to some of the same steering mechanisms and controlling mechanisms and accountability mechanisms as other public sectors. So this relationship then between higher education and the environment is a key dimension, I think, in higher education throughout the world. And as part of that, and as part of the expansion, and in some countries right now, the cuts that are being made in higher education, trying to make higher education more efficient, is to try and explain and understand change. How can we investigate this? How can we understand the change processes in higher education, especially in a sector where change is seen as something very difficult? Because often when we talk about higher education, we don't talk about so much about change. We talk about stability and how difficult it is actually to foster change in the sector. So this complexity, this increasing complexity that higher education is now embedded in larger in the larger policy area, that increases the complexity. We see that more actors are being interested in higher education studies. So I think this complexity that is surrounding higher education also need to be reflected more theoretically. If we then have a quick look, and it's not my intention to provide you with a detailed overview of all the theoretical positions that are found in higher education research. I think we would have needed a lot of different lectures to actually account for that. I will just hint to some of the richness that is involved in current higher education research. I think if we look back into what is being published, I think we can see richness or even then fragmentation with respect to theories. Resource dependency perspectives, for example, were used quite early in this sector, not least also to show changes that have been taking place in the funding of universities, where in a lot of countries we see that more result-based and outcome-based funding models have been introduced, and that does something with the relationship between universities and those that fund universities. In the same way, in principal agents, perspectives have been applied in a increasing number. Again, it goes back to this, how can I put it, renewed interest that the state has in steering the sector, while at the same time perhaps also allowing for institutional autonomy. And of course, the principal agent relationship is exactly about how can the principal, the state normally, make the agent behave, and the agent here being the university, how can the state incentivize or steer or foster agentic behavior that is in line with what the principal wants? And of course, in this theory, we also find elements also showing how the agent can play with the principle, so to speak, how the agent can avoid some of the initiatives coming from the principle. So I think this is also an important theoretical perspective in the study of higher education. Institutional theory has been very popular as well. I have used the institutional theories. A lot of people have used institutional theories, and especially the neo-institutional approaches, which are more related to the globalization of the sector, has been extremely popular throughout the history. Cultural approaches have been applied in various ways, both with respect to institutional cultures, but also the many contributions that have been made when it comes to understanding how the disciplines that we have in higher education, how they also create some certain forms of cultural behavior. I think one of the classic books in this area, Tony Beecher's Academic Tribes and Territories, is one example of very fruitful cultural approaches. And related to all of this, we can see that as universities are developing and are given some kind of autonomy, more instrumental and more strategic change perspectives have also been applied, where it is assumed that the institutional management, the institutional leadership of universities actually has power to make strategic changes, and that we can see that universities are also starting to become more strategic actors in the sectors. So while these, single theories are important, and they are very fruitful, I'm not saying that some theories are better than others. The problem with some of these is that we often stick to single theoretical perspectives. We are not combining them because what they do is to focus on certain problems, on certain relationships, and they can be useful in relation to certain research questions. So, but of course, I think we all would agree that to be able to use multiple theoretical perspectives would, in principle, open up for broader and richer types of explanations. But it is also very demanding with respect to scope. If you really are to bring in 2 or 3 theoretical perspectives into one research study, that is very complicated. So that's why my suggestion is, okay, could we find some kind of a compromise here? Could some theoretical analytical concepts that can be found and that can be related to one or more of these theories, could they be used as a way to focus the empirical investigations in more detail? And could that also actually bring us together more as an empirical field, where people working with different theoretical concepts could actually come together by sharing some joint analytical concepts? So let's go to one of these concepts and provide some examples of how it can be related to different theories, and how organizational identity can be used as a case for this coming together of different organizational theories. Albert and Whetten, they produced a very interesting, a relatively minor article back in 1985, and I think in the beginning, there wasn't that much attention to it, but it became much more important over time. I think the backdrop of this, and for those that have read the article, I think they explained themselves that they were professors at a research-intensive university in the US, and that university experienced a small cutback operation. But that cutback operation wasn't really that dramatic because no programs were closed, no one lost their job or anything. So it wasn't actually that dramatic. At the same time, they experienced that the cutbacks that happened created a heated debate that they couldn't explain with standard theories. So they invented this concept of organizational identity, which have some similarities also to some of these classical concepts that Burton Clark has been talking about, the organizational sagas. But I think one of the promising aspects of this concept is that it's basically a concept about stability. All right, so organizational identity is some kind of stability that is trying to be coined here. But it is also very useful if we are to explain change, because if we are to fully explain change, we also need to have a point of departure for studying change, and that is, of course, stability. You need to explain change in relation to something, and that something would, of course, be stability. The concept of organizational identity is built on 3 different types and propositions of stability. And again, this is going back to Albert and Betten's article, where they use this CED. They call it the central character, the endurance, and distinctiveness from other organizations. Of course, they invented this concept back in 1985, and perhaps they didn't really think through all of these dimensions when they coined them. And that has also created a lot of fruitful discussions and elaborations on organizational identity over time, because some of these dimensions could be seen as overlapping. For example, whether a central character, of course, to be central, it has to have some kind of element of endurance as well. And you also have this idea that it has to be distinct from other organization. So if we go into some of these dimensions more in detail, this is my attempt to show how these concepts that they are providing, the central character, the endurance, stability, and the distinctiveness, how that can be interpreted and applied in creative ways. Okay, because these dimensions are basically empty. You as a researcher have to provide some kind of interpretation of what is the central character. So what could be examples here of a central character of a university? I think in many countries you see that the higher education is divided, for example, between a public and a private sector. And you could see that being a private university is sometimes different from being a public university. It has something to do about the security. It has perhaps something to do about the adaptiveness to market, and that can actually shape the key characteristics of the university. And of course, we also know, all of us here, that universities comes in different forms and shapes. You have research-intensive universities like Oslo and Beijing universities. You have other universities that have a more technical profile. Some are more professional, some are vocational. We have universities that have been established, especially in the late 60s and early 70s in Europe, that some universities were formed on the idea that they should be interdisciplinary, they should be alternative type of institutions. And then you have single discipline institutions like, for example, business schools or medical hospitals or medical universities that focus very much on one discipline, one research area. And of course, that could contribute to shape the central character. At the same time, you could also argue that the central character can also be shaped by, how can I put it, external factors. For example, where a university is located, in what region, for example, it is located, whether it's urban or rural, or whether it has, for example, an ambition of becoming a world-class higher education institution. So central character may not only be related to cultural characteristics, but can also include issues such as ownership, formal structure, history, and what have you. Let's go to endurance then. And of course, as I said, it has a gray zone here, because the endurance of something, then it has clear links to the centrality. But again, just to provide a little bit of input into what could we use as examples here, as empirical examples. I mean, that could, for example, relate to the scope of educational offerings, the mode of educational offerings. Some universities are, for example, they have a proud history of being distance learners, that they want to have a strong profile in distance education. It could be related to funding streams, strategy, governance, and so forth. What is interesting, I think, in when it comes to this endurance dimension, is that it also opens up for more historical oriented studies in higher education. I mean, again, if we go back to the early days of higher education research, most of the studies conducted there were historical. I mean, again, if we go back to, for example, the Burton-Clark article on organizational saga, that was a historical article, trying to explain how a university developed over time. And of course, because universities are some of the oldest institutions in the world, there's been a lot of historians have actually dived into and tried to understand how the university has developed. But what I miss today is a little bit of this historical dimension in many of the current studies, because we are so obsessed with change. We are more looking into the future, and perhaps we are missing something here by trying to understand, okay, what is the ability to change in the future based on what we have done and what we have managed to achieve in the past. I have done some studies in this area myself, for example, related to the establishment of some of these alternative universities, and it is kind of interesting, and there is actually quite a lot of possibilities also of conducting these kind of more historical oriented studies, because there is often a rich archive in many of these universities, opening up for document type of analysis and so forth. Of course, how the critical question is here, okay, how far back should we go? I don't have a fixed answer to that. But I think we need to go back more than a couple of years if we are to say something that is related to identity, because again, endurance would imply that there is some kind of stability here over time. So perhaps going back 10 years, 20 years, I think that could actually provide a richer understanding of how the university actually is changing. And again, that would also open up for, I think, more interested historical-oriented data collection and diachronical comparisons. Let's then go to the distinctiveness dimension. And this is, of course, perhaps the core of the organizational identity concept. And this dimension really opens up for analysis of not only of single institutions, but also of sectorial developments and how higher education institutions position themselves within the larger sector they are embedded within. And this goes, of course, to the double meaning of identity. Because we often think of identity, that is a concept that says something about us as individuals or as the individual organization. But of course, identities are always shaped and described in relationship to others. So be able to say that I have a unique identity, you always have to refer to someone else. So identity has this double meaning of being an individual concept that is also constantly in some kind of comparison with the larger environment. And in that way, organizational identity is a concept that can actually be applied both for conducting micro studies and micro studies in my interpretation of this here is individual case studies, but also meso studies where you, for example, compare 2 or 3 universities, or even macro studies where you try to see how identities of universities is developing within a larger region or a sector or a country or even globally. For example, how global university rankings is impacting the uniqueness and the distinctiveness of some universities. Again, there are jobs to be done here. I mean, how should we define distinctiveness? What are the key elements here that we should use? I think that if we look at, again, in the literature on higher education, I think there is a lot of contributions that could also be, I mean, some of these contributions are also basically analytical concepts. I mean, think about, again, a classical contribution in the area of higher education is the book by Burton Clark that he wrote in 1998 about entrepreneurial universities. Yushu here has done quite a lot of work on this area, and the idea of an entrepreneurial university is also basically an analytical concept, because the entrepreneurial university doesn't really is not something that can be linked to a particular theoretical position. It is an analytical concept that we are trying to develop here. Later, we have seen other books also being shaped on the market-based university, on the innovative universities. And I think that there is an interest here in among higher education researchers. What I find unfortunate is that we see a tendency often to perhaps not always exploring these concepts that are offered, but there is an interest by higher education researchers desperately trying to find out their own concept, trying to be very creative and to invent concepts themselves. Of course, that is a part of the research journey, I think, that we also all want to put our mark on the field. But I wish sometimes that we could try to also to use our forces also to go more critical into some of these concepts that have been developed. That being said, I think the example of entrepreneurial university is an example of a concept that became very popular, that has attracted a lot of interest, and where we can also see that that a lot of researchers are being interested in exploring both the opportunities, but also the limitations of this concept. If we then dive a little bit into the theoretical underpinnings of the organizational identity concept, again, there is a rich literature here trying to say something about this. What were the foundations that led to the establishment of organizational identity, and how should it be defined actually? Glenn, I think, has provided a very simple dichotomy that is actually working quite well. Of course, you could be critical to whether only two positions are possible, but at least it is a way to try to structure the different contributions here. What she is saying is basically that organizational identities could be defined in two different ways. Either in an essentialist way, where the idea is that organizational identity is something that reflects the true character of an organization. This is the real thing. While the other position is more a strategic notion, where the concept of identity is seen as something that could be manipulated or governed, not least by the institutional management, so that you could play with it and develop images of the university, for example, in the form of strategic plans where you portray the university in particular ways, and that you hope that this way of portraying the university would also impact the internal behavior of the university. But a consequence of these two positions is that it also open up for the complexity here, because that means that if we think that both elements, both positions hold true, that we see that yes, there is perhaps an essentialist dimension in organizational identity, and yes, perhaps identity also can be manipulated, then we open up for more complex explanations for both change and stability in this area. And not least that identity is something that can be developed both from within the organization, as some kind of organic development of the organization, or that it can even be influenced by ideas from the outside. For example, when governments tell universities that they should be more entrepreneurial, and that universities try to adopt features and characteristics that are more aligned with external expectations, or for example, when global university rankings portray the ideal university as a world-class university, and that the focal university is trying to adopt and develop characteristics that can actually that are aligned with these kind of external expectations. That creates an interesting dynamic, these outside forces and these internal factors that can meet and shape organizational identities. So this duality of organizational identity open up for links to a range of theoretical perspectives. For example, strategic perspectives, where you could see that university leadership, for example, can actually try to manipulate or govern university identity in particular ways. If we go back to the old institutionalism of Philip Selznick, one of his ideas was that organizations, they actually develop in organic ways over time. They become infused with value, as he says, because then the identity is then reflected in certain practices, certain routines, that this is how we do it. And I'm sure, for example, in Peking University, you have also there are procedures that are distinct ways of how you do things in Beijing University. We certainly have it in Oslo University, and I'm sure they have it in Tampere as well. So there are some interesting characteristics here that we could explore. Also, there are links here to organizational psychology, because we can talk about organizational identity, but organizations without members are nothing. And of course, the interesting question is, okay, do those that are members of a university, do they always buy into the organizational identity that the university want, or that the university think it has? I think that there are some interesting studies also showing that at the bottom level of a university, a lot of researchers, they are in an ambivalent position, because they have a lot of loyalty toward the discipline where they have their educational training. They are biologists, so they are political scientists, so they are sociologists, so they work within these particular distinctive disciplinary perspectives. At the same time, they are also part of being, they are also members of a larger university. And sometimes they are proud to be members of that university. So they also have this identity of belonging to a larger organization. And this, of course, can also create tensions that could make for fruitful investigations. If we then look at some other more externally oriented perspectives, I think I've already mentioned neo-institutional perspectives, and how many universities are shaped by societal expectations about being world class, or by being driven by some of the ideals that you find in global university rankings. We can also see the relationship here between identity and this principal agent perspective, not least as we see in many countries that governments want to steer the diversity, steer the division of labor in the sector by establishing contracts with universities, saying that your university should develop in particular ways. If we again go to China, you have this double first class initiative, for example, which is kind of an interesting where you select some institution. And you say to them that you should be particular kind of institutions, and there are thousands of other universities also in China, but you pick 142, I think, or something like that you provide them with a label and say, well, this is how you should be. So a lot of the definition of the identity is then shaped by this external expectation of how the university should become, while other universities in China have perhaps a bit more freedom, those that are owned by regions or have other types of ownership. And of course, it relates also to resource dependency theory, how universities, due to the need for money, become interdependent of some external funders, and that some of those external funders also could contribute to shape the identity of the particular university. So going in for landing here now, my argument here is that I think what we are in need of is more advanced and more sophisticated explanations of organizational change, and that these simple theoretical models that we have used, regardless of the brilliance of the theories, they offer limited insights. And for example, I mean, if we look to the classical neo-institutional idea that due to globalization, universities should become more similar. I think if we look into, again, the empirical evidence here, is yes, we can definitely see that university becomes similar on some dimensions, but at the same time, they are also more diverse on other dimensions. So this idea of imitation, this idea of convergence of identity, it is only partly true. So we need to develop more sophisticated models to explain that we can see that similarity and diversity can actually take place at the same time. One of those that have tried to come up with interesting explanation of this, and I've provided this reference for today, is the article by Gioia et al. from 2000. This is an old but a very interesting article where they show how identities could actually be constructed as recursive processes between inside and outside factors, and how this relationship between identity and image is important. Ideally, we would all like identity, that identity would equal image, that there is coherence between our identity, who we are, and the image, who others think we are. That would be fine if we have this kind of full alignment between identity and image. Of course, it is very rare to find these kind of adaptation or these kind of alignment. And often we see that what we think we are and who we think we are is that it doesn't really fit with the image that others have of us. And of course, if there is a huge gap here, stakeholders could accuse universities of trying to fake, trying to become false institutions, trying to provide some kind of a facade, trying to decouple, showing a nicer picture to the outside world than what really is happening. So this kind of, what they argue is that this kind of how can I put it, lack of coherence between image and identity actually is one of the factors that create change. Because they say that if the outside world has a very different image, well, what could happen? But either you need to change the image or you need to change the identity. So something needs to give in if you are to find more alignment here between identity and image. And I think this way of trying to understand complexity is also one of the reasons why we currently in so many research areas we see a lot of interest also in hybridity. You know, how can we understand hybrid organizations, or how can we understand organizational paradoxes, etc. Let me see. I also have tried to contribute a little bit to this area by arguing that not only, and I totally agree with Gioia et al. that it's very interesting, this internal external dynamic that is very important for understand both stability and change. But I would also argue that you need to differentiate between what you could call deliberate processes, where, for example, the institutional management is really trying to push identity into a certain direction, and more organic changes, where this takes place in more natural processes. And I've been trying to identify some of the dynamics that could actually take place here if you combine this internal external dynamic with the deliberate organic processes that we also can find. And I've tried to identify then 4 different outcomes where trying to understand 4 different situations where organizational identity can actually be useful with respect to interpretation, where you see path dependency take place within organization, images, going back to the Gioia argument, innovation, where a lot of taking as point of departure that if identity is a social construction, it also opens up for a lot of different constructors that can engage in different ways, leading to unpredicted change. And of course, integration, where you also bring in the power element, that of course the institutional leadership, they do have power, they do have some influence of how universities develop, although we should be careful by exaggerating the influence of the institutional leadership. So to land, I think what I've been trying to argue for here is that the use of more open analytical concepts that can link to different theoretical perspectives may foster more multi-theoretical insights into the empirical cases that we are studying. Also, that an outcome hopefully could be richer explanations. And I think a more pragmatic argument is, of course, that I know that in contrary to a lot of other research fields, we don't have that much research money available in higher education. So these large-scale research projects that you could have in some other disciplinary areas, they are more difficult to fund in higher education. So it's something about, okay, what are pragmatic ways forward? And by using analytical concepts, we can perhaps arrive at more mid-range type of research projects that can actually be undertaken with the limited resources and time available. And finally, also, I think by applying analytical concepts more consistently, we could also offer something to others. I mean, we have been importing a lot of perspectives and theories in higher education, and I think we can also provide, we can give something back to the larger research community, and to give something back to, for example, institutional theories, where we can see that they have been trying to develop some kind of analytical concepts that have provided very fruitful in developing institutional theory. For example, by using concepts such as logics or work or discourse, that can, again, concepts that can be applied across particular institutional fields. Well, that was basically my main message. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I think you covered a lot of concepts, especially regarding how to developing a more enriched explanation of organizational change, especially by linking organizational identity to other theoretical concepts. I think that's very interesting, especially regarding the new possibilities of not using a single theoretical perspective, but maybe integrating multiple perspectives regarding the real world phenomena, such as you mentioned the double first class phenomenon here in China, and other kind of related change in the educational field. So thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Now we are open for the floor for the questions. So you can either raise your questions by typing into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and open your microphone, introduce yourself, and then raise your questions. So please.
Maybe people want to have lunch, or at least in Oslo.
All right. So before everyone, people are preparing their. Okay, here are some questions. So there's one question from the Visna. Would you like to open your microphone and raise a question yourself, please?
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this talk. It was a really great overview of the field and the different dynamics and dimensions to consider. I was just wondering about if you could reflect a little bit exactly about basically your last slide, where you talked about the little bit more complex approaches to organizational studies in general. And how do you see these kinds of processual approaches, or however you would call it? So these approaches that are exactly trying to understand these change processes and let's say organizational cultures, organizational discourses, these kinds of approaches in relation to the concept of organizational identity, as you elaborated. You did mention a little bit these dynamics within the concept of identity itself, but I would really love to hear a little bit your thoughts on this. But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that question. Of course, there are different routes forward, but I would like to come back to this this possibility that we also have for fostering more historical studies. Again, I think if we are to understand, we need to understand identity. We need to and change. We need to also to look back to understand how identities were before. And if we let's say if we go back 20 years and use that as a starting point and then collect data now, we might see two different organizations. And what would be very interesting then is of course to try to investigate, okay, what were the main drivers here? So having more historical studies is something that I would really like to advocate for in higher education. And of course they could be anthropological as well. One of the things, again, coming back to this problem that we have in higher education research is that that we have limited resources, right? Often we don't have these large external funds that we can draw upon. So often we work in smaller groups and we have limited resources and one of the things that costs money in higher education is to collect data. That is extremely costly to do interviews or to run surveys, large scale surveys where you are hoping for a good response rate. One of the advantages that we have in higher education is that we have usually very good archives in universities. So to do document analysis, for example, to go back and investigate, for example, minutes of meetings that took place a long time ago is one of the possibilities. And it is cheap. The data is already there. Of course, you need to spend time and energy in interpreting them and analyzing them, but at least you save money and energy. So it provides you with a very interesting design without having to spend that much money on the research, so to speak.
Thank you. Yeah.
There's another question from Sarah Lee. Would you please open your microphone and raise the question yourself, please?
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Hi, Professor. Sorry, the light is. Oh, sorry. It's my camera is not very stable. And thank you for your presentation. Thank you for telling us the conflicts between the image and identity. And here is my question. Maybe it's not very professional, but I'm really curious. You talked about identity and image, and you talked about university rankings. Do you think university rankings can be driven by the external factors or internal factors?
I'm not quite sure what you. I will try to answer what I think you what I think you are looking for here. Again, I've been doing some studies on university rankings as well, and not least how rankings are impacting on university strategies. It is kind of interesting. I mean, we published some years ago. We published together with some colleagues from various countries. We tried to study how 80 universities in different regions in different parts of the world, how they adapted to university rankings. What we did was to try to select universities that were included in that were selected and were listed by global university rankings, and also some universities that were not ranked by these global rankings. And remember, I mean, this was a study where we used the neo-institutional approach. And one of the basic assumptions behind the neo-institutional approach is that, well, you will have, I mean, those universities that are at the bottom of the ranking list, so to speak, they will try to imitate those at the top. And what we had as a standard assumption before in this research was that, well, does that also mean that some of those universities that are outside the current rankings, are they trying to get on the inside of rankings? Are they trying to behave in ways that are similar to those that are already ranked? And to our surprise, we found that, well, a lot of those universities that are outside the rankings, they are not trying to become like those that are ranked. Some would say, thank God for that. But it was a very interesting, finding. And again, it is a finding that questions some of these ideas behind convergence that we see in the sector. So the convergence is perhaps take place within cohorts of universities. For example, those cohorts that are ranked. There we could see those that are ranked and are a bit lower in the ranking. There we could see some of this behavior. But for those universities that are not being ranked by these global rankings, they had different strategies. They wanted to become something else than those universities being ranked. What is interesting there, I mean, is of course that what we see right now is that a lot of the current global rankings, like Times Higher, the Shanghai ranking, and so on, they are expanding the number of institutions in the ranking, which potentially could mean that what the rankings actually influence the field, because then as soon as you become, I mean, our studies show that as soon as you become included in the ranking, you are trapped. So then it's much more difficult to have deviant behavior. But if you're outside the ranking, if you are so lucky to not be ranked, you have a possibility of actually developing a different kind of identity, so to speak, a different kind of strategy, which is interesting. But more research would need to take place here. And based on that, I would say that of course universities are affected by external rankings, but external rankings affect those universities that are ranked, not those universities. And that goes for the majority of the universities in the world. If we think we have 20,000 universities in the world, around 1,000 of them are currently being ranked. So that means that instead of focusing just on those 1,000 that are being ranked, we as higher education researchers should also try to understand what is happening with those 19,000 other universities. I mean, take China as an example. You have many thousand universities that are not ranked by the global rankings. They play an important role in the higher education system. How do you understand the development of the system of those universities? And perhaps we need to we need to acknowledge more that and look into that kind of that kind of universities in the future. Interesting question.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for the questions. And now, please, Reddit, would you like to open your microphone and introduce yourself? Raise your question, please.
Yes. Hello, good afternoon. And hi, nice to see you, Professor Bjorn. Great to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yes, and thank you very much for this highly informative presentation. I was listening and thinking, and I have two main questions. And I think the first one would be that can we even consider the possibility of a higher education institution possessing multiple identities at the same time, and perhaps each of them prevailing or strategically being deployed in certain circumstances? And could we think of that? And that's my first question. And the second one is that can we even ignore the idea of identities as strategic notions in the understanding of any realistic, any empirical analysis of an organizational identity? Can we take any identity analysis without considering identity as a notion that is strategically deployed? Sorry if my questions sound.
No, but I think these are super
Thank
interesting. Thank you. And again, I think they are questions that really focus on this issue of complexity. Your first question is about, is it possible for universities to have multiple identities? I think so, yes. It is kind of interesting to see, again, for example, if you go in and study strategic plans over time, you could see that a lot of the strategic plans that universities are developing, which are supposed to be based on their organizational identities, you could see that they are becoming broader. They try to be everything for everyone. So they, especially, for example, like Oslo or again Beijing, you could see that yes, we are trying to be world class, but we're also trying to be important for the region. We cater for education, but we are also very much focusing on research. So yes, I think there is a tendency there that universities are trying to find ways to cater for their multiple identities. And again, this would be a very interesting area for research. Okay, how is this process going on? For example, under what conditions would universities highlight some part of their identity, for example, while trying to de-emphasize other parts of their identity? That would be super interesting. And your other question is, can we ignore the ideas of identities closely related to strategic leadership? I think it would be very difficult to ignore that part, but I would be careful by assuming that the identity that you find, for example, in strategic plans or in mission statements or whatever, that those kind of identity expressions are true in the essentialist way of the understanding, because they could be more strategic adaptation to external expectations. So again, what I would say is that it would be interesting again to, for example, start out by studying strategic plans or mission and vision statements, but also combine that kind of data with other types of data, for example, by organizational members, of whether they are actually buying into some of these kind of ideas and identities that are being proposed by the university leadership. in that way, you could also try to understand, okay, what are the conditions then for change? Because of course the university leadership is also dependent on some kind of support. We are academic institutions. It's very difficult to command academics around. So we need, if we are to change higher education, we are so much dependent on the willingness of academics to buy into some of these change processes and to support them, that they think that these are legitimate claims. This is also what I want as an academic. This is the direction also I want to go. So there is again an interaction here. So I think what could be interesting studies related to your second question is, okay, how are, again, going back into the formation of identities, for example. So how do strategic plans come about? Who are allowed to provide input into strategic plans? Are they merely developed by the institutional leadership? Have students been allowed to provide input into the strategic plan? In some countries that would be unthinkable. In other countries that would be seen as natural. Academic staff, to what extent have academic staff been involved in some of these processes? Again, linked to some of these latest development when it comes to the research on strategy in general. I think that there's been some very interesting studies by some UK researchers, Paula Jarzabłowski, and what she and her colleagues have done is to see strategies not as an output, as a piece of paper, but to understand strategy as a continuous process, as strategizing, saying that, well, strategies are also, they also have to be developed somehow. And the interesting from a research point of view is that, okay, who are allowed into this interpretation process, who are allowed into this translation of ideas that eventually end up with a certain strategy or then a distinct identity. So that, I think that would be also a very interesting area of research, not only to take the identity as granted, but to look critically at some of those identities that universities now are displaying on their web pages and in their fancy strategic documents, and go behind the facade, so to speak, to really understand some of the processes that have led to these kind of documents. That would be super interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have a question regarding you referring to the Gioia 2000 paper. Mentioned about adaptive instability
Yes.
as a kind of the tensions between the organizational identity and the image, and also become the source of change. Previously, in the first talk, we invited Rumor Pinheiro talking about this idea about resilience. So my question is, resilience is kind of organizational adaptation to the environmental changes. But will resilience also related to this kind of changing image or changing identity? Because previously you mentioned universities could adopt multiple identities, right? Will this also a way they kind of respond to the environmental kind of changes?
Yeah, I think so. And I haven't seen that. That recording. So, but I know Romulo well. So I think. I think that is also, I mean, resilience is also a very interesting analytical concept that is now being used. But again, I think the idea here now is to try to develop these kind of concepts also more analytically, so that you can have some dimensions that you could actually research. What I find promising with identity is that they have these dimensions, centrality, endurance, distinctiveness, that where you can explore some of the propositions, some of the underlying dimensions here. And right now I miss a little bit. I think resilience is an area where where again it is promising, but I think there is more work to be done here to carve out some of these propositions in more detail. But yes, it could be related indeed.
Thank you very much. I think there's a question from Lee. Yeah, please open your microphone and raise your question, please.
Hello, Bjorn.
Hi.
Yeah. Thank you for your insightful presentation. It is very informative to delve into the identity issues of higher education. My question is, how do you unfold the overlapping and changing values of competence development curricular policies in the Norwegian university colleges where university applies sciences, in the process of struggling between economic and pedagogical and local and regional practices with recent structural and financial and pedagogical reforms? The reason why I ask this question is whether it is difficult for the professionals and learners as an agent to define their identity from the structure and modules, if actual unit of learning are fully integrated into the contents of education and research and innovation and regional development, etc., into curricula. Thank you.
Wow, that was I didn't see that question coming on the development of the Norwegian higher education sector. But thank you. It is one I try to. I'm currently the vice rector of Oslo now, so I'm desperately trying to keep my research career alive. And one of the things I'm looking into is exactly this structural reform that is unfolding in Norway, where for those of you that don't know, the Norwegian higher education system has been exposed to a lot of mergers lately, where a lot of former university colleges have been so-called upgraded to become full universities, either through a merger where they have joined forces with other university colleges and then become universities, or that some of the former universities have actually merged with the university colleges and how can I put it, brought the university college into an established university structure. And of course, some of these basic processes that you talk about, teaching and learning, is one of those elements that I think what is the central character of an organization. And we can see that for many university colleges, teaching has become or has been, historically speaking, very important. And of course, with them becoming universities, there is a heightened expectation that the research dimension should be more important. So that these organizations, they also need to change. They also need to change their internal focus, their central character, so to speak. What I found particularly interesting in Norway is that I mean, a classic way to organize universities in Europe is to organize them within faculties. And a lot of the university colleges that we had in Norway, they were not organized in that way. But a lot of those colleges that eventually became universities, they also changed their organizational structures. So they had more of a, how can I put it, more of a school organization in the past, and then they changed into a more discipline-oriented internal organization, saying something also about how identities also might impact structure. And I find this this highly interesting. And although I would say that there would be no reason for why some of these younger universities, why they should imitate the old universities like University of Oslo with respect to their internal structure, they have done so. And by doing that, and again, it is some kind of they have compared their own identity with the rest of the field, and they say, oh, we are very different than the older university. But instead of developing a unique identity of their own, they have imitated part of the structure and part of the internal logics of the established universities, even though they often were created on the idea that they should be alternatives to the traditional universities. So here we can see very interestingly that some of these change processes, they have elements of both imitation, but also of diversification, a process that initially were seen as a diversification process actually have become a process of convergence. So it's kind of interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question and also interesting response, because right now in China, many of the universities, after almost 20 years of dismantling faculties into schools, now they reorganize faculties again, especially in Sino-Finnish University and my university.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting how the identities shift, I think, in different dimensions. We almost run out of time, so we can entertain the last questions if we have. Otherwise, we will close our session for today. Any other last minute questions, please? All right, Bjorn, so thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and also thank all the audience for the interesting and also delightful discussion. And so we're looking forward to seeing you all in the next lecture in middle of the December, actually by Professor Cai Yuzhuo next time. So thank you very much for coming to our lecture today. So see you in the next time. See you. Bye.
Bye, everyone, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. 哎，这终于有你了。